I would like to open the floor for questions to all of the speakers. Just reminding you, we have Olivier Michielin, we have Oli, we have Eddie, we have Charles, MICHIELIN, and Jan KORBEL, and myself. So are there questions on any of the talks that you would like to ask? I have some questions, but I want to open the floor. Okay, yes, please.
Olivier, so you showed us that you were collecting various types of data, and then you told us that based on that data, you can enroll patients into certain drug treatments, you get a 30% response. I'm assuming that the major driver of that is the genetic information, or is there other types of information that are now feeding into this?
It's a very good question. Actually, we have witnessed a transition. We started this program 5 years ago, and indeed at the beginning was the situation. But I think more and more what we realize is that the immunotherapy predictive biomarkers are taking the stage now. So for example, you know, there are some very rudimentary ways of looking at, you know, the T-cell infiltrate, but now we're also starting slowly to implement AI-based approach where we can look at the cluster structure of the T cells within the H&E slides, and that seems to be predictive of response as well. So now we are starting to see a shift towards precision immuno-oncology, and there the biomarkers are becoming more broad than the you know, mutations that we had from the genomic sequencing effort only.
I would like to change a little bit the topic. I'm a surgeon, and I know this is not a meeting about surgery, but we are here to decrease the inequalities in the therapeutics for cancer. And as you know, the landscape of surgery has changed dramatically in the last years. In the 90s, we have started laparoscopy, and in the year 2006, and then the robotic has come. And there are huge differences between the two systems, and I would like just to share a few numbers that you might be interested to know. There are now around 6,000 robots in the world, mainly, of course, in the developed countries, and we do 1,500,000 procedures per year. And there is an increase of 15% year by year. At the same time, we are doing 15 million of laparoscopic procedures worldwide. So 10 times more. And of course, laparoscopy is much less expensive, but in most cases can do as well the job. Just to give you the conclusion of these few words, 60% of the surgery today is done with open surgery. We have a 30–35% of minimal invasive surgery. Therefore, only 2% of the surgery which is done today in the world is robotic. Probably will expand, but I think laparoscopy has a place and will keep a place in the future around. Thank you very much.
And I'm sure this is a topic that we will be able to come back to later on in the meeting as well. Thank you. So I know there's a question to my right, and then there's another question behind me. Please.
I actually have a question to all speakers, but that will be too much, so I will select two of all. And my question is, we heard wonderful examples and very driving and stimulating examples of cutting-edge research, which is bringing forward the field. This morning, we talked about that it is necessary to have in the translational continuum also a link between research and care, because that is basically driving the field in cancer. And how can that be done in a world where we also need cutting-edge research and the critical mass in institutions to perform such cutting-edge research? And I would select perhaps from the speakers Charles and MECHTHILD, because they come from completely different fields on their opinion on that.
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, I work at the oldest comprehensive cancer center, I believe. It's 100 and something years old. And I would say the sort of secret sauce would be that the proximity of the basic scientists and the what I'll call more translational scientists, who are all also laboratory-based, and clinical partners, the geography of that, even with Zoom and so forth, is really important. And I know it's, I know that's the design of many of our centers. I also think the spirit of collaboration across cancer centers is very, very real. I will, of course, acknowledge that there is also competition between cancer centers, not only for academic glory, but also for clinical revenue. But I can tell you, even, I've moved pretty high up in the organization, and the spirit of collaboration is winning out in every sort of corporate discussion. So I'm optimistic. But I think in terms of the context of this meeting, the infrastructure to build a cancer center is quite substantial. And that's the challenge for the lower income countries.
Yeah, I think proximity is also an answer that I would give. Maybe I will give you an example. In our center at Oncoray, we have preclinical research, of course, not very basic research, but preclinical and also clinical research. And only the short distance between the people that they meet every day is, I think, a very big advantage. But I think it's not only geographical proximity, it's also if you get such people from preclinical research and from clinical research in the same program, where you can give some incentives that you finance joint topics also, and this can also be within one country between different centers, but then you force somehow that they talk to each other and meet each other. I think this could also be something that would be very helpful, because often, and this also makes a lot of sense, often there are large basic cancer or basic research centers, and then there are large clinical departments, and there is not a lot of link between them.
Thank you for that. Maybe I could actually add a question that is slightly, relevant to that, and it is about how to train clinician scientists to try and close that, preclinical to clinical gap. I've, throughout my time, both when I was at the ICRF and for many years at the Curie Institute, this challenge, even when there's proximity, physical proximity, is still there. So are there any, ideas to all of our speakers about what could be the key types of approaches to really try and make sure we train a new generation of clinical scientists who will allow, that gap to be bridged as effectively as possible? Yes.
I have a lot of experience on that question, and as I think many of you know, we have degrees, MD, PhD degrees, but I think we also have what we call late bloomers, which is people who don't really get either the science bug or the medicine bug until they're a little bit later. And I think we need to have an open mind and encourage all of those paths. I'd say the biggest threat that I see to this is actually the biopharma industry. And I think it's a combination of the amount of time it takes to become doubly trained, the pressure to have families and so forth, particularly for women. And I've seen more and more competitive pulling of our talent, even at the graduate training is finished. They haven't even done their independent laboratory yet. So I don't have a solution other than we're now very much increasing the compensation level of our postdoctoral fellows in the US.
Thank you. Yes.
Oops. There we go. If we build a bridge, of course, we build from both sides. And I think there's been such a focus on clinicians coming into research labs. And I think some places do this, but I think most you should embrace taking scientists into the clinical environment for exposure to that setting to understand in the other direction as well. And I think we bridge the gap in both ways then.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Just a comment on this. I think education is of great importance because I think we all agree, especially when they listen to the talks now with the complexity in the basic research that has to be converted into early clinical trials. We have the prioritization, I said, but we need to select what is most beautiful or most interesting for patients in the future. And I remind me of in the investigation about 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years ago. We checked the educational activities in the main centers in Europe, and we asked for different direction. And it turned out that practically no education was in place for translational cancer medicine. So that was the reason why, and it was Julio CELIS who suggested that we need a summer school for this. And we started also a summer school. And it would be very interesting to go back now, 10 years later, to see what activities are going on in the main centers about education towards translational cancer medicine. And specifically, I would say, with this early translational research and interaction, because it must go in both ways, not only that clinicians come to the basic research go to clinicians. We need an educational program which is effective to create the preclinical research.
Summer schools and maybe sort of boot camp as well, forcing people together to make sure that the interactions happen. So, okay, yes, I haven't forgotten. Manuel would like us to ask a question. Maybe I could let him ask a question and then we'll come back to you. Yes.
Thank you. I'll be very fast. My question is essentially for Jan KORBEL, but also for you, Edith. And is about how far you see Europe at large and the MBL in particular to be able to consider diversity in the genomics, the database. Actually, Charles has already mentioned this question because we know well that most of these studies have been based on European citizens. And with the world demographic prospect in 30 years' time, Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, we double the population, but also in Latin America and in Asia, this is becoming a clear issue. For instance, in Brazil, it has become very well identified. So how far will you be able to open the diversity in the databases for genomic studies?
Yes. You want to start?
Because of the nature of the European Bioinformatics Institute, for example, we are always seeking to make sure we can encompass as much as possible. And in fact, the MOU that we signed with UNESCO was very much along those tracks. And we already have initiatives that reach out to Africa and South America. The idea is generating data is becoming easier and easier, making sure you curate it properly, you store it properly, you share it properly. That is the key. And that's where we feel that we have a duty to help. So, but I will hand over to Jan, who's much more of an expert than I am.
Yeah, thank you, Edith. So in my mind, there's two aspects of this. So first of all, we have the awareness, that's important, but there's two aspects of this. One is to actually do research with the Global South. And this we have not, we have all as a field not done as good as we could do it in the future. So that there needs to be more of a focus on that in my mind to get our knowledge and expertise into those people's minds that work in the Global South and get the expertise to these places, because in a sense, we'll only be able to reduce inequalities if knowledge is at the place where people will suffer from cancer. The second aspect, the scientific aspect, is also important, and there we're actually actively currently pursuing a study. What we all in cancer genetics and genomics use to compare our data against is the so-called human reference genome, which is by and large from a European person, and that means that it will be more straightforward and less erroneous to identify somatic mutations from a European patient compared to a non-European patient, because the reference is not the same. And there will be, it's known that there are errors made in classification of variants compared to non-European references. And there actually EMBL is actively involved. We're actively involved in a study called the Human Pan Reference Genome Consortium. My lab has recently gained access to a collaboration between 3 European labs to 1,000 long-read genomes, where we sequenced using long DNA reads individuals from 26 populations, in this case based on cell lines. These are 1,000 genomes data, but we anticipate through this study to get a better set of reference genomes from individuals from different population backgrounds. So that can also, to some extent, help reduce inequalities, at least in the variant interpretation, which we know is very strongly European biased currently. And through this study, we hope will be less European biased afterwards.
Thank you. So yes, back to you. Thank you.
We also had a presentation on radiation therapy and the lack of radiation therapy infrastructure in many countries in this world. I think what is a current very interesting development that would drive down costs and deal with capacity problems and could be a revolution, not just in Europe and the United States, but then also would have consequences for the lower and mid-income countries, is the MRI-guided precision radiation therapy for prostate cancer, the #1 cancer in men. We are doing now only 5 sessions instead of 25 to 35 sessions. 5 sessions, and we're running a randomized trial of just 5 sessions to just 2 sessions. So that whole radiation therapy thing in prostate could be reduced potentially, when this phase 3 trial is done, to 2 sessions. Breast cancer has been reduced from hyperfractionation of 7 weeks to 5 weeks to 3 weeks, and we think it's going to go to 5 sessions. Based on this development, we will have an overcapacity of radiation therapy infrastructure in the Netherlands, perhaps in 7 years from now. So this would be a tremendous impact on all countries who are lacking infrastructures and advice as to how that should be guided. So we also need to take a picture of medtech and what medtech can do for reducing costs and creating more accessibility and equality.
Thank you. Yes, your neighbor.
Back to one of the most important tools mentioned, education and its relatives, dissemination and communication. I think the structures that are now developing under the Cancer Mission and Europe Beating Cancer, with the comprehensive cancer centers nationally being organized, and we will get examples in the next session on that, and the international or the European organization of a network of the comprehensive cancer centers by itself is a platform for improving educational tasks. We have created in the Cancer Core Europe first the summer school that was inherited from the early days of these programs 10 years ago, and it's extremely successful. But of course, it's 1 week, and it's sort of a case. It could be used much more. I think one could take care of the participants and have some kind of follow-up with them, etc. We have also started a pilot experiment with future young leaders in cancer research, mixing clinicians and basic scientists, that actually runs for 3 years, very short sessions at one of the comprehensive cancer centers at a time. But what I would like to say is that the clinical research, for reasons which have been mentioned here before, in contrast to the basic research, has a much lower mobility between the countries. And I think there is a tremendous impact by those clinicians who made a real postdoc, for example, from Sweden. I work in Sweden, INGEMAR, Stockholm, Karolinska. They usually go to America for a postdoc. Not all, not at all, maybe 5%, 1%. And on that theme, I would plead for using the Cancer Mission window of opportunity to look into clinical exchange programs. I know that it's extremely bureaucratic and hard to fix it. There are language barriers, etc. But I think anything from 1 week to 2-3 months programs within Europe for clinical exchange would be a dramatic tool for decreasing inequalities, both in research and for the patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. I've heard similar sort of arguments in the UK simply to try and attract continental Europeans for exchanges, and it is dramatically difficult. So if we could jump that barrier, it would be amazing. Yes, Giulio, I think this will be the last question, please.
In the Cancer Mission, we usually talk about creating infrastructure, right, which are sustainable. Now, the MBL is a sustainable intergovernmental organization. And the question is, in your view, are the member states considering supporting similar infrastructures in the future?
Switch my mic. Ah, now I can. Thank you for the question. The question of, I mean, it was a statement that EMBL is sustainable, and I hope it is. I have to admit, and I wasn't planning to talk about this, but you know, our 28 member states have been incredibly supportive and generous in the last few years, but in the current financial crisis, we are being challenged, and it isn't easy to actually rise up to those challenges with 28 funders. So sustainability is very much in my mind right now. I'm sure EMBL will, you know, survive, and this crisis, as many other institutions are facing this crisis. But I really do believe that having infrastructures that are sustainable is essential for science and, you know, human health initiatives to survive. I mean, I think the pandemic really showed us this, and I feel it's so obvious that this is what we should be doing. I'm always stunned when there's a question about whether or not it's sensible. So to answer your question, which is, are there other such initiatives being thought of or other such organizations? Well, I think there have been many ideas for other such organizations. I mean, I could cite one that I know of, ELIS, which is an initiative for AI. I think, you know, EMBL was created with some very specific missions in mind at the time to address the need for large infrastructure in structural biology. So, and also to try and make sure that young scientists stayed in Europe and didn't brain drain to the United States and elsewhere. And I think in the area of AI, there could be a good argument that something like this should be set up, but also in other areas. And I think the realization we have is that member states will only contribute so much to so many. And I fear that we have now entered into a period where there's much less unity across Europe and more singularity and, I would say, nationalism. So I would preach for more European integrative thinking and perhaps new infrastructure. But right now, I feel like my voice is a little bit hollow, but we're trying.